Namaste, Shalom, Assalamualaikum, Amitofo, Sat Sri Akal, Ala Abo, Wakantangka, Nichi Un, Mitahola. The focus of this lecture is Interfaith Dialogue towards a culture of peace, but it's important to set it in the initial context. If we look at the history of humanity, we acknowledge the significant role of religion in all cultures and civilizations. And religion or faith is definitely intertwined with the lives of people and even the affairs of nations. Now, of course, the modern world has witnessed the rise of science and technology, and there has been this expansion of secularism. Indeed, in many countries now, there are clear ground rules for the separation of, quote-unquote, religion and state. However, despite the impact of secular perspectives, principles, and practices in all aspects of life, religions or faith continues to play a major role in the contemporary world. Now, recent data shows that perhaps about 84% or over 6 billion of the world's population believe in a faith or religion. We have the four major religious faiths: Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. But there are diverse other faiths which are smaller in numbers and some are more new, so to speak. Because the older faiths like Judaism and Taoism, indigenous peoples have their wisdoms and spirituality traditions. There's Jainism, Shintoism, Sikhism, and Baha'i. Now, many countries have populations who now profess these various faiths. So you could say that many countries are multi-faith, with majority faith sometimes, and of course then minority faiths or religions. We've seen also that migration as a phenomenon has increased faith or religious diversity in many countries as people move across the world to other countries, bringing along their faith or religious commitments and practices. Now, one controversial issue that has arisen in present discussions in regard to the role of religions or faiths in contemporary world is, namely, are religions or faiths causing conflicts and even violence in the world? Of course, there are historical examples in which peoples of different faiths have been involved in conflicts and even violence. Examples such as the Crusades, the expansions of religions across original territories has occurred in colonialism. One perspective strongly argues that religion or faith has reinforced, justified, and caused conflicts and violence. And this view has been magnified or reinforced especially after 9/11, with the rise of various violent extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the like. And this view has led some commentators and analysts to indeed question the need for religion or faith in modern life. But on the other hand, there is another perspective that argues that it is not correct to argue that religion or faith is a root cause of conflicts, evil, and violence. This alternative view acknowledges that even in religions or faiths, there are aspects of scriptures and holy texts that do express hatred, disrespect, and even violence towards other religions or faiths. However, many religions or faiths also uphold values, principles, and beliefs that do promote the philosophy and strategy of non-violence and acceptance of other faiths. And indeed, in history and until today, there are many examples of peoples of faith and religion who are taking action to build a peaceful world through non-violence. So, for example, in Christianity, we've seen the long-standing tradition of non-violent action in modern days, whether it's Martin Luther King campaigning for civil rights, Bishop Tutu and others who campaigned against apartheid in South Africa, and numerous Christian activists have undertaken non-violent action to promote social justice and to defend against militarization and political repression. In Islam, it's been pointed out that if you look closely at the Quran and other teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be unto him, there are many values and principles that do promote non-violence and peace. And there is also strong advocacy in Islam for justice, human rights, and the sacredness of all life. Of course, in the Eastern traditions of Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, we have an emphasis on ahimsa, or the principle of non-killing or non-harming. And this has been a guiding reference point for all these different Eastern faiths. Moving now to the present, various international agencies have taken on leadership to promote the role of religions in building peace. And among them is UNESCO. In 1994, UNESCO brought together peoples of different faiths and religions and proclaimed the Barcelona Declaration on the role of religion in the promotion of a culture of peace. And I'll read an extract from that declaration. It says, quote, "In human history, religious traditions and ethical ideals have frequently been used to justify wars and injustices. But the real message behind religious and ethical beliefs is unerringly directed at peace and fraternity." And another quote, "The Declaration expresses solidarity with all non-violent peacemakers and pledged to favor peace by countering the tendencies of individuals and communities to assume or to teach that they are inherently superior to others." Now, one specific strategy involving religions or faiths in building a culture of peace is interfaith dialogue. Originally referred to as interreligious dialogue, the term interfaith dialogue is now commonly used, since faith is often seen to be more inclusive than the term of religion. Faith is seen to include not just the organized religions, but also a broad range of spirituality traditions. And the rest of this short lecture will be a concise introduction to the growing presence and role of interfaith dialogue in the world. The key dimensions that I will try to raise in this introduction are: what is the vision and mission of interfaith dialogue? What are the procedures and processes for conducting interfaith dialogue? What are some examples of interfaith dialogue? And not least, how can interfaith dialogue create the building of a holistic culture of peace? Now, when we look at interfaith dialogue, the first step really is how different faiths and religions can dialogue to help increase mutual understanding of each other, to build trust and respect, goodwill and harmony. It's part of the learning to live together, which is one of the 4 pillars of education promoted by UNESCO over the decades. At the same time, interfaith dialogue would acknowledge that there are differences between religions and faiths. We find those differences in different doctrinal dimensions of each faith or religion. But acknowledging them also requires the capacity and the willingness to critically respect those differences. And third, in interfaith dialogue, there is a need to find common ground on shared values. Indeed, the more peoples of different faiths and religions dialogue with each other, they actually find that despite the differences, we do share many common values and principles. Values and principles such as love, justice, non-violence, respect, understanding, forgiveness, reconciliation, compassion, and many other common values and principles. Now, the differences will need to be dialogued as well, but this often should happen after the initial trust and sharing of common ground has been successfully promoted. Now, interfaith dialogue would also promote critical reasoning and reinterpretation of each other's faiths. Next, we can talk about 4 different levels or categories of interfaith dialogue. There is, of course, the well-known dialogue of Theological Exchange, where theologians and other religious leaders of different faiths would come together and share their understanding about each other's theological doctrines, and that's a very important part of interfaith dialogue. But there is also the dialogue of religious experience, where followers and believers of different faiths come to understand and know each other at the level of religious experience. So, for example, being open to attending each other's religious events and festivals, and being able to not just observe, but in some cases being willing to participate as well in those events. We also have the dialogue of life, where it is people of different faiths getting together, if you like, as neighbors, as members of the community, of a city, of communities living side by side with each other, and relating to each other at the level of friendly communications, of sharing their daily problems and concerns about life, their families and their communities. And this dialogue of life can build trust and goodwill that can lead to other forms of interfaith dialogue. But last but not least, there is a dialogue of action, and that is peoples of different faiths and traditions having understood each other better and finding that we actually share many common values and principles. We should take the next step and act together. Let us cooperate to build a more peaceful, just, and sustainable world. Interfaith or interreligious dialogue has a number of principles, and those who have been active in promoting interfaith dialogue would argue that we need to approach the dialogue on the grounds that we are quote-unquote equal, that we need to listen carefully to each other, we need to be honest and sincere in the dialogue. Certainly we should avoid comparing each other, pointing out the errors and the mistakes of the other, but in a way claiming that we are free of any such errors of themselves. It's also important that we trust each other as we are dialoguing. It's not a process by which you're trying to convert the other to your faith, tradition. And last but not least, we need to have a sense of self-criticism, that we do not see our tradition as being perfect, and that we're able to think of ways in which our faith and religious tradition can more closely practice the ideals and principles which we believe in. Now, as we are trying to understand each other and finding the common ground, I like to emphasize again that interfaith dialogue really encourages different faiths and traditions to think of ways of cooperating and collaborating to act on those shared values and principles. And when we think about peace in the world as multidimensional, in GCED, we say that peace is not merely the absence of war. Of course, we need to dismantle a culture of war, but to build a peaceful world and peaceful lives, we need to live with justice and compassion. We need to be local and justice peace. We need also to promote all human rights and responsibilities. We need to build intercultural respect, understanding and solidarity. We need to live in harmony with the earth, because unless we can live peacefully with the earth, humanity will not survive. And last but not least, we need to be able to nurture a deep sense of inner peace. And all these different dimensions of building a culture of peace are very relevant to the role of religions and faiths in peace building and in interfaith dialogue. Let us now turn briefly to a number of examples of interfaith dialogue movements in the world. There is, for example, the Parliament of the World's Religions. It may not be that well known that more than 100 years ago, in 1893, in Chicago, different churches and other religions in Chicago invited representatives of diverse faiths to come to the city at the World Congress of Religions, which is now known as, if you like, the first Parliament of the World's Religions. And the intention of that meeting was to promote harmony among the world's religious and spiritual communities. But it took another 100 years before the modern Parliament of the World's Religions was established. So in 1993, the Parliament of the World's Religions was revived again in Chicago. And the Parliament of the World's Religions really has a vision of a just, peaceful and sustainable world, in which of course all different faiths and religious communities can live in harmony and contribute to the building of a better world based on their wisdom, a sense of compassion, to be able to overcome distrust, hatreds and divisions, to acknowledge that human and religious diversity is very crucial to building a peaceful world. And the world's most powerful institutions, whether it's political, economic, and even religious, need to move beyond narrow self-interest to realize a common ground in which the earth and all life is cherished, protected, healed, and restored. Now, every 5 or more years, the Parliament meets in different cities of the world. For example, in as I said, the first 1993 in Chicago, and then in Cape Town, 1998 in South Africa, in 2004 in Barcelona, in 2009 in Melbourne, later in 2015 in Salt Lake City, and this year in 2018 it will be held in Toronto, Canada. And at these parliaments, thousands of people of different faiths gather to learn more from each other, to share their work, their missions and programs and projects all over the world in which they're trying to promote peace. And of course, through these parliaments, people live with a deeper understanding of each other, but also inspired to work together for a peaceful world. Then there is another major international interfaith dialogue organization called Religions for Peace. Actually, it's even earlier than the Parliament, because it started in 1970. The major religions got together and agreed that they need to work to build a more peaceful world, and that's why it's called Religions for Peace. And again, it meets every 5 years or so in the global assemblies. But in different regions of the world, as in Asia or Africa, the Religions for Peace also meet to develop interfaith dialogue at the regional and local level. And the Religions for Peace now has had a good record in different projects, such as trying to promote reconciliation in armed conflict zones, whether it's in Iraq or in different parts of Africa. It has promoted an international network of religious women's organizations. It has contributed to assist those who are suffering from the HIV/AIDS pandemic. In Kyoto in 2006, the religions held its assembly there, and they came up with the concept of shared security, to say that unless all societies of the world, all religions, all governments, and all other kinds of social, political, and cultural groups unite to rethink security not in narrow terms of political self-interest, economic self-interest, but human security, or indeed planetary security, in which the care of the environment is also very crucial. The third, younger, international movement for interfaith dialogue is called the United Religions Initiative, and it's based very much on the formation of grassroots cooperation circles, 4 or 5 or more peoples of different faiths getting together to promote interfaith dialogue. And again, they have many activities to promote interfaith action for building peace, for promoting justice, sustainability in different parts of the world. Now, these international movements, of course, are really reliant on the active promotion of interfaith dialogue at local, national, and regional levels as well. So examples are, for example, the Susila movement in Mindanao in the southern Philippines has been promoting Christian-Muslim dialogue over the decades and encouraging members of both communities to promote understanding of each other, but also help in promoting the peace process in Mindanao. In Nigeria, there is an interfaith mediation center in which Christians and Muslims again have been attempting to promote more peace and harmony among the different groups and to transcend violent conflicts that have affected so many parts of Nigeria. In New York, the Interfaith Center has brought together faiths of different traditions to share their views on building a more peaceful United States and the world, including training in non-violent direct action. In northern Uganda, the Choli Religious Leaders for Peace have been working great devotion to help to resolve the conflicts and wars caused by the emergence of the Lord's Resistance Army and to build reconciliation actions after the war has been stopped. In the Middle East, Jews, Christians and Muslim leaders have got together to proclaim the Alexandria Declaration, which is to try to build peace in the Holy Land. The Interfaith Youth Corps in Chicago has been involving youth in universities to think of their own faith identities and to build peace and harmony among each other as well as in the wider society and world. When we talk about building a more peaceful world, we have to build a more just world, and many interfaith movements have sprung up to work on that. For example, the International Freedom from Death campaigns. There are now international interfaith movements to overcome HIV/AIDS, to combat the rise of malaria again as a disease in which many thousands of people continue to suffer and die every year. There is even an international interfaith investment group to encourage different faiths and religions to think how they invest in a way that would be sustainable and which promote justice and human rights. In the UK and the US, there is a so-called Sacred Lands Project. Different religious traditions are looking at the lands they own and how to make it more sustainable and more peaceful for the needs of their communities. When we think about living in peace with the environment, different interfaith movements have also risen to work on that issue. The Alliance of Religions for Conservation, for example, has been encouraging diverse faiths to develop intergenerational plans for more sustainable futures. And so thinking of how their own institutions and communities can actually help to preserve the earth and to challenge issues such as global climate change. And in this regard, over the last several years, interfaith movements have advocated governments and international agencies to really address this vital problem of climate change, because if we do not address it, then there's great dangers for humanity and the earth in terms of survival. And last but not least, different interfaith movements have also promoted the empowerment of women. We do know that in different cultures of the world, patriarchy exists, and as a result, women and girls have been discriminated against and even suffer gender-based violence. And now different interfaith movements have said it is necessary for all faiths and religions to really practice the ideal and principle of gender equality, and therefore the empowerment of women and girls as well as men to build about a world in which there is gender justice is really a vital part of the Interfaith Dialogue movement. And so these are just some examples in the time I have to point out some of the positive signs for how Interfaith Dialogue can help to build a more peaceful, just and sustainable world. Of course, there are many challenges in terms of promoting interfaith dialogue. Some of them would include how do we bring in followers and leaders of faiths who are not keen on interfaith dialogue because they feel that their faith or religion is truth. And so how do we move from an attitude of exclusivity towards an attitude of inclusivity? Another challenge would be how we can promote minority faiths and spirituality traditions to be involved. And another one, going back to the gender question again, would be given that women's role in different faiths and traditions can be marginalized, how do we ensure that women also have an equal place at the interfaith dialogue table? And last but not least, the challenge of action. How do we move beyond just talking in interfaith dialogue, actually committing ourselves to practice? How do we encourage each other at the level of individuals, communities, institutions, and international organizations to really promote the core values of peace and justice and compassion and kindness and respect and forgiveness and reconciliation and sustainability into building this more peaceful, just and sustainable world, which is really in the vision of all faiths and traditions across the generations and across history. Thank you, and I hope that you will explore these issues and questions as you are engaging in developing a wider and deeper understanding of global citizenship education. Thank you.